I am noticing that the socialists in this country are becoming more bold and more open. They honestly think this country is ready for full-scale European socialism. I mean, I'm hearing Lawrence O'Donnell over here and Bill Maher over there. Bill Maher, who was once referred to as a libertarian. Bill Maher doesn't have a libertarian stripe in him. He doesn't have one aspect of his political belief system that's libertarian because he's never been affected by socialism. I love this new, we have the clip of audio, maybe we'll play it. But now it's, well, we're not against profit. We just think the government should be running hospitals and schools. There shouldn't be private sector schools. Does that mean you're going to get rid of Harvard? You're going to get rid of Columbia and Yale? You're going to get rid of private schools? Everybody's going to go to a public school? No more Horace Mann in New York City? Horace Mann being the epicenter. Horace Mann School here in New York City is, when you read these stories about these neurotic, psychotic women on the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side of Manhattan, who from the day after deciding not to abort their babies, from the minute the babies are born, they want them in this program and that program because you got to get them into the right nursery school, then the right preschool, then the right kindergarten. To get them into the right private elementary school, you got to have them on track to attend an Ivy League institution. Well, Horace Mann is one of the schools that is a breeding ground for elite liberal Democrats. It is a private school here in New York City. If you go on their website and you look at their alumni, I mean, it's basically just about every left-wing elitist from New York City is either attended there or sent their kids there. Are those the schools that these people plan on banning? Are they going to be ready for it if we're going to go all European socialism? Are they going to be ready for it when the government says, now that we've taken over the hospitals and the schools and now we're ready to take over the TV and the radio networks, like MSNBC. The Europeans don't believe in free speech the way we do, or at least their governments don't. You can't just get on the radio and give your opinion. You can't just get on television and give your opinion. You can't do that in Canada, and you can't do that in Mexico. The United States is purely unique in its belief in free speech, although many Americans who pretend to be in favor of free speech only mean when they're talking. They want plunder. I got two things in front of me. I have Bastiat's The Law, and I have a piece from the Wall Street Journal, February 26, 2009, The 2% Illusion. I want to just give you a couple of quotes from Bastiat, because when you look at the law, I don't know how there's any rational human being who can read Frederick Bastiat and say, oh, I reject that. Because what you realize when you start to read the political theories and philosophies of socialists and Marxists and communists is that it's better to be on the inside of the party because then you don't have to participate in all the things that are levied against the people. Case in point, the SEIU seeking its waiver from Obamacare. Case in point, all of these organizations that supported Obamacare, like AARP, now looking to not participate. When you hear people say, the American people, it's like they're withdrawing themselves from the group and viewing everybody else like they're residing in some weird ant farm, and they need the big visible hand of government over them all day, all night, throughout their lives, or else God knows what would happen. I mean, God knows what would happen if people were just left to their own device. We can't have that. They won't do what I think they should be doing. They won't do the right thing. They won't do the smart thing. No, they'll do whatever it is that they want to do. Some people just can't live with that. Existence, faculties, assimilations. In other words, personality, liberty, property. This is man. It is of these three things, it may be set apart from all demagogic subtlety, that are the interior and superior to all human legislation. It is not because men have made laws that personality, liberty, and property exist. On the contrary, it is because of personality, liberty, and property exist beforehand that men make laws. What then is a law? As I said elsewhere, it is a collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense. Nature, rather God, has bestowed upon every one of us the right to defend his person, his liberty, and his property, since these are the three constituent or preserving elements of life. Elements, each of which is rendered complete by the others, and that cannot be understood without them. For what are our faculties but the extension of our personality? And what is property but an extension of our faculties? How could you argue against that? We don't have property simply because we have the law. We have the law to defend our property. We aren't people because there's a law. Because we are people, we created the law. And the law isn't something that applies only to people that we think it should apply to. It either applies to all of us or none of us. And what is the purpose of law? Why do we have them? Let me read another quote to you. When law and force keep a man within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing upon him but a mere negation. They only oblige him to abstain from doing harm. They violate neither his personality, his liberty, nor his property. They only guard his personality, the liberty, and the property of others. They hold themselves on the defensive. They defend the equal right of all. They fulfill a mission whose harmlessness is evident, whose utility is palpable, and whose legitimacy is not to be disputed. This is so true that, as a friend of mine once remarked to me, to say that the aim of the law is to cause justice to reign is to use an expression that is not rigorously exact. It ought to be said the aim of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, it is not justice that has an existence of its own, but it is injustice. The one results from the absence of the other. But when the law, through the medium of its necessary agent, force, imposes a form of labor, a method, a subject of instruction, a creed, or a worship, it is no longer negative. It acts positively upon men. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own will, the initiative of the legislator for their own initiative. They have no need to consult, to compare, or to foresee. The law does it all for them. Try to imagine a form of labor imposed by force that is not a violation of liberty, a transmission of wealth imposed by force that is not a violation of property. If you cannot succeed in reconciling this, you are bound to conclude that the law cannot organize labor and industry without organizing injustice. When from the seclusion of his office a politician takes a view of society, he is struck with the spectacle of inequality that prevents itself. He mourns over the sufferings that are lost, that are the lot of so many of our brethren, sufferings whose aspect is rendered yet more sorrowful than the contrast of luxury and wealth. He ought perhaps to ask himself whether such a social state has not been caused by the plunder of ancient times, exercised in a way of conquests, and by plunder of more recent times effected through the medium of the law. He ought to ask himself whether, granting the aspiration of all men to well-being and improvement, the reign of justice would not suffice to realize the greatest activity of progress and the greatest amount of equality comparable with the individual responsibility that God has awarded a just retribution of virtue and vice. Who can argue these things? Who can argue against these things? That when the government looks at inequality and has not realized it is the agent of inequality through a violation of the law, through a redistribution of property and wealth, through a confiscation of property and personality, through imposing a form of labor on one group of people in the name of the other group of people, it's no wonder why you have this inequality and this mass suffering. When you legalize plunder, plunder becomes legal and it becomes preferred. You look at European socialism and you listen to these people like Lawrence O'Donnell and Bill Maher and the rest of the MSNBC lineup on the left side of the media, and they look at that and they say, why? Why can't we do that? Well, we can. We can. But do you know what that will mean? That will mean all that you have, all that you get, all that you receive, all that you are qualified to do is decided for you by government. And you will have an aristocracy. Now, we have an aristocracy in this country. All countries have an aristocracy. But there's nothing socially or legally preventing you from being a function of your own device. Are you going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg? I have no idea. But in a controlled economic environment, unless you are close to the center of power or part of the access class, you don't get the opportunity to be a Papa John, a Wayne Huizenga, a Mark Zuckerberg, or anything for that matter. When you look at a society like Sweden, where almost 50% of the population is receiving something from government, that so much so to the point they don't need to work to their full potential, you destroy human potential. 1-866-95 Patriot. And this idea that socialism is going to close the debt and the deficit. I want to go back to just after the inauguration of Barack Obama. The 2% illusion. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Take everything they earn and it still won't be enough. President Obama has laid out the most ambitious and expensive domestic agenda since LBJ. And now all he has to do is figure out how to pay for it. On Tuesday, he left the impression that we need merely to end tax breaks for the wealthiest 2% of Americans, quote unquote. And he promised that households earning less than $250,000 won't see their taxes increase by one single dime, quote unquote. This is going to be some trick. Even the most basic inspection of the IRS income tax statistics show that raising taxes on the salaries, dividends, and capital gains of those making more than $250,000 can't possibly raise enough revenue to fund Mr. Obama's new spending ambitions. Consider the IRS data for 2006, the most recent year that such tax data are available, and a good year for the economy. The quote-unquote wealthiest 2%, roughly 3.8 million filers, had an adjusted gross income of over $200,000 in 2006. That's about 7% of all returns. The data aren't broken down at the 250 point. These people paid $522 billion in income taxes, or roughly 62% of all federal income tax receipts. The richest 1%, 1.65 million filers making above $388,000, paid some $408 billion, or 39.9% of all income tax revenues, while earning 22% of all reported U.S. income. Note that the federal income taxes are already progressive, with a 35% top marginal rate, and that Mr. Obama so far is proposing to raise it only to 39.6%, plus another 2 percentage points in hidden deduction phase-outs. He'd raise capital gains taxes and dividend rates, but those both yield far less revenue than the income tax. These combined increases won't come close to raising the hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue that Mr. Obama's going to need. Now, here's where it gets good or dicey, depending on who you are. Let's not stop at the 42% top rate as a thought experiment. Let's go all the way. A tax policy that confiscated 100% of the taxable income of everybody in America earning over $500,000 in 2006 would have only given Congress an extra $1.3 trillion revenue. That's less than half the 2006 federal budget of $2.7 trillion and looks tiny compared to the more than $4 billion Congress will spend in fiscal 2010. Even taking every taxable dime of everyone earning more than $75,000 would have barely yielded enough to cover that first $4 trillion. What more do you need to hear? If they were to raise the taxes to 39.6% and bring it up to 42% with deduction phase-outs, and then get really nutty and confiscate 100% of taxable income from every single American earning more than $75,000, they wouldn't even close the debt and the deficit. And if they got somewhere close, they would consider the debt and deficit manageable, then increase it. The spending will not stop. Now, I'm going to provide you in the next segment perfectly executed economic analysis that cannot be debated. I'm going to use Venezuela as an example. Because in Venezuela, every single time they nationalize an industry, they look for the next industry to nationalize to support the previously nationalized industries that are now failing. So first they took oil and they redistributed all the profits to the poor. And then lo and behold, there was less revenue because the rigs weren't being serviced, the engineers weren't being paid, the oil industry was not being treated as it needed to be treated. So what did they do? They nationalized the power grid. Now they have ordered blackouts and brownouts. They can't make it work because their business model is one of failure. I'll get into all of that. The arguments cannot be broken. We're right, they're wrong. That's the end of the story. Am I sounding angry? I'm not angry. Sirius XM Patriot. Venezuela. If you look at Venezuela, every single time Chavez nationalizes an industry, he looks to the next industry that he's going to nationalize because he now needs capital to support the previously nationalized industries because his business model for them doesn't bring the revenue into government anymore. One of the first big industries that was nationalized by the Chavez government was the oil industry. And he sort of gave it to the foreign investing companies. You could take it or leave it. Some of them took it, some of them left it. And he began to redistribute the oil revenue to the poor, and he started to fix prices on food. So the thought was, well, I'll have all this money, and I'll give all this money to poor people, but then I'll dictate the prices of necessary food items, and everybody will have enough money and nobody will go hungry. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to Caracas. The oil industry began to give the government less revenue to work with because all of a sudden it didn't have the money to keep up its infrastructure, its rigging, paying its engineers, its refiners, some of its foreign investment pulled out. In other words, it began a downward spiral of diminishing results. When the government just fixes food prices, magically two things happen. The producers of the food stop producing as much as there's no more profit in it, and now that the people have free money and low prices, they buy more than they need, and there are shortages. The pricing system, the function of pricing, is to force the consumer to decide the value of the product. If you were to have a Starbucks next door to a business that just had free coffee. I was in an Advanced Auto Parts store the other day getting something, and it said, have a cup of coffee on us. Well, I thought to myself, do I really need a cup of coffee? Do I want a cup of coffee? I don't know. It's free. I took a cup of coffee. I took a cup of coffee that I wasn't sure I really needed or really wanted, but it was free, so I took it. Now, if I was not really in the mood for a cup of coffee and it said, here's a cup of coffee, $1.50, I'd probably have thought at that moment, $1.50, I really don't want a cup of coffee more than I want my $1.50. The pricing system makes you decide what you want more, the product or the service or the money that you have to transfer in order to gain the product or the service. That's what the pricing system does. The other side of the pricing system is a function of production and profit, and we can do that a little bit later. But the bottom line is, when you aren't confronted with the pricing system or opportunity cost for that matter, it's no wonder why you have shortages. And Venezuela still has, for all of its wealth redistribution and concern for the poor, they still have starvation, they still have food shortages, and the government is still nationalizing industry, because every time they nationalize something, they destroy it. Look at the electric grid. Look at the power grid of Venezuela. If the government is so good at running this without a price structure or business model or a profit motive, why then is it that Caracas has nightly blackouts ordered by government? We're not talking about a shutdown where a power box or a power station had a mishap. We're talking about the government saying we don't have enough power to run the city anymore, so just shut it all off. Except for, of course, the presidential palace. How is that? Is this the socialism that you want? Are you going to be happy when Social Security is bankrupt? Are you going to be happy when Medicare has no more money? The fact of the matter, people are being told they have to give things up. I got news for you. It's going to be taken from you whether you like it or not. Just wait until this amnesty thing goes through. You just wait till there's 20 million people running around bringing in their family members who've never contributed to this country a day in their life, who are going to need things. You bring somebody into this country, a grandma, a great aunt, a this, a that, they're 50, 60, 75 years old. And they automatically buy it. It's like the thing with affirmative action and the DREAM Act. If there are quotas and set-asides for Latino students, and yesterday you were an illegal immigrant, today you qualify for the DREAM Act, guess what? They're not going to go, well, you're a second-class Latino student. You qualify automatically. So on Monday, you're an illegal immigrant. On Tuesday, you're at the front of the line. If Monday you were a 75-year-old living in some village in Mexico, and on Tuesday you're sitting in San Diego, California, guess what? You qualify for Social Security, and you qualify for Medicare, and you're going to qualify for Section 8. Who's going to pay for this? Where's it going to come from? What's the difference, right? We're all good-hearted people. There's only so good of a heart you can have before your country and you go broke. And then you ask yourself, why the hell did I do this all these years? Honest to God, you look at motion versus being in motion versus being stationary. Rest and relaxation is preferred. If you didn't have to do anything all day, you probably wouldn't. You need a motivation to do something. Take, for example, exercise. The First Lady wants all of us out there moving. Now, I'm not against exercise. I actually used to be a gym rat, and now I'm kind of getting myself back to that. Getting myself back to lifting heavy weights, running long distances, getting my abs and my core in shape. Why? Because I want to look good. If there was no physical benefit, no physical attribute to working out, very few people would do it. Somebody would. But if you couldn't improve your appearance through working out, it would be a tough sell. Yeah, spend all this time building up to running 5 to 7 miles. Spend all this time building up to benching 4 plates. Spend all this time to having a ripped core or squatting 400 pounds. For what? To look the same as everybody else? Nobody would do it. When you can sell stationary as equivalent to being in motion, stationary will become preferential. When you can sell people on the idea that they can get something for nothing, getting something for nothing is preferential to getting something for doing something. And when the government looks around and says, popular, unpopular, we got to save this versus that. When the government bailed out General Motors, it punished every single American that had nothing to do with the failure of General Motors. The only people that didn't get punished were General Motors. The only people that got punished were you. Unless, of course, you work for General Motors and you're a member of the UAW. Oh, I'm sorry, and the shareholders. The shareholders got punished. They were told, guess what? This private property of yours is not really yours anymore. We're taking it over. It's now property of the U.S. government. Oh, by the way, in the UAW, we're just going to transfer private property into the hands of the UAW. Because the UAW could possibly be to blame in any way, shape, or form for the failure of General Motors. Funny, the only car companies, now Ford's rebounded. Ford didn't take the bailout money, but they were having a bad time around the same time as Chrysler and GM. Funny, the only car companies that are having a really bad time right now, or did in the past couple of years, are the ones organized by the UAW. It couldn't possibly be any of their fault. I don't see Volkswagen having a problem. I don't see Mercedes having a problem. I don't see BMW having a problem. The only problem Toyota has is Ray LaHood. Is Nissan having a problem? I don't think so. Why is that? Well, there's a myriad of reasons for that. But when the government promises plunder, when the government promises things will be delivered where they're coming from, don't you worry about that. You ought to be scared. So you want European socialism. Oh, it's going to be so wonderful. European socialism. We're all just going to have the government taking over. Yeah, because when the government takes over the hospitals, it's going to stop there. Government never stops its motion unless the people stop its motion. Government only grows. And if European socialism is such a good idea, how's the EU doing economically? How much is the German economy being dragged down by the Greeks right now? You know, until the European Union, we looked at Europe as a continent, but outside of diplomacy, they weren't one single nation. Now they're acting like one single nation. And the strong states are being dragged down by the weak states. Greece is a drain on Germany, and there's only so long that, and you know what? I don't mean to be a history buff or anything, but I don't know. Something always makes me nervous when the German worker feels like they're losing their identity and they're being infringed upon by forces beyond their control. I don't know. That sometimes makes that just scares me. But how long is the German worker going to take it from the failures of Greece before they say, enough's enough?